So let me say hello to our audience, whoever you folks may be. And today, I wonder if you have checked your cortisol levels and your oxytocin levels and things like that lately. If you haven't, then you may be in big trouble because there's a lot hanging on what kind of hormones we're producing in our bodies. And today we're going to talk to an expert on the subject, Dr. Jonathan Downes, who is in Victoria, British Columbia. I presume at your home, right, Jonathan?
That's correct, yeah.
With a wonderful Indigenous art piece behind you. Very good.
That's right, right.
Great. So Jonathan Downes is a pediatrician who works with children who have neurological issues. And I don't know that I have any neurological issues, but I think most of us nowadays have mood issues because of the COVID thing. And of course, because the world is a hard place. And, I just talked to somebody in Russia who's deeply depressed, and she says, it's just because of Russia's politics. Well, if you care enough about politics and war and peace, it sometimes is enough to get you down. So I think it's time to have a conversation about the physiology of our emotions and our relationships, our personal relationships, especially now that many of us have gone through about a year of social isolation. And that has some physiological effects. Is that right, Jonathan? Am I misleading the world in deciding what we need to talk about?
Yeah, yes, that's right, Meda. But I just want to make a disclaimer. I'm not an expert. I'm not a biologist. I'm not a developmental psychologist. I'm a developmental pediatrician, and I see children with developmental problems. So my interest in this area stemmed out of a conversation I had around love, actually, the concept of love, and how that word has been used as it's a man-made construct. And so I started looking a little bit more at the biology of love and how we have evolved as social beings. Because I certainly see that on a day-to-day basis. One of the concerns that I have on a day-to-day basis with my patients is adversity, something called adverse childhood experience. The acronym is ACE, ACE, adverse childhood experience. And we do know that adversity impacts not only childhood outcomes, but also adult outcomes, so that children who experience adversity, particularly in their early years, often are subject to mental health difficulties as adults, even physiological change, for example, diabetes, obesity, hypertension. There are a range of medical conditions that seem to be dependent on the level of adversity that children experience in their postnatal life. And even before children are born, they have a prenatal life as well. So adversity during the prenatal life appears to be a factor for subsequent medical and mental health difficulties as adults. And there's a robust literature around ACEs. So that's on the one hand. So there's a risk, but there are protective factors. So that term that I've just given you, the ACE, has now been updated within the last couple of weeks, actually. And so now we talk about positive. So it's now PACE, P-A-C-E. So there are protective factors. I like to think of them as resiliences or assets, and part of those protective factors mitigate against the risks. So on the one hand, you have risk. On the other hand, you might you have something that might be thought of as resiliences. So you have protective factors and you have risk factors. And so I see children, unfortunately, who often have a whole host of adversity in their background. Alcohol, for example, during prenatal life, can lead to a condition called fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. And I see a lot of children with that condition, unfortunately.
Are these people whose mothers were alcoholics, or
not necessarily alcoholics, but who were drinking during the early stages of pregnancy, not knowing they were pregnant?
Does a person have to drink in order to have that kind of effect?
Yeah.
I wonder, I mean, most of the women watching this are going to say, oh my goodness, I had a drink or once a week or something like that.
Even before a woman has missed her first period, those first couple of weeks can be significant. Fortunately, there are protective factors. So even if alcohol is consumed during a pregnancy, not every baby has fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. Is a major factor for many children. But we also have protective factors, and one of the biggest protective factors is love and nurturing and caring. And we hope that all children, benefit from a loving, caring, nurturing home. And we know that fortunately, children are amazingly resilient, and despite adversity, that opportunity to flourish. We are social beings, and when we emerged from the deep oceans and came out onto land, before reptiles, before mammals, I'm talking about deep time, we had to be prepared to protect ourselves. And there are peptides which allowed us to do that. So protect ourselves from, for example, dehydration. If you spend your life in the water and you come out of the water onto dry land, one of the first things we have to do is protect oneself against dehydration. And there's a peptide called vasopressin, which allows us to do that. Vasopressin has the ability to prevent dehydration, and it conserves water. But not only that, but vasopressin is linked to other peptides, for example, adrenaline, noradrenaline, and you've probably heard of those, to related peptides, which allow an individual to fight or fly or run away. So one has to protect oneself against adversity. Now, of course, once that is established, once one's able to protect oneself and survive, one also has to thrive. So one of the sister, or I guess you call it sister peptides, is a peptide called oxytocin. So and oxytocin historically was a hormone that was responsible for lactation, and it was a feminine hormone. We use oxytocin to establish social bond, pair bonding. Mm-hmm. So when the mom looks at the baby and the baby looks back, that is a reciprocal interaction, usually involving eye gaze. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, there's a smile. And then there's the nonverbal communication. So that falling in love with your baby is key to future flourishing. And that is dependent upon oxytocin release. Not only the release, but also the receptors, because if you recall, a receptor is important for action. So we've seen that recently with COVID, for example. You've seen the little receptors. And so the spike on the COVID has to find a receptor to make its action, right? Uh-huh. So
oxytocin has spikes and looks for a hole to insert the spike.
Yeah, that's correct. Well, it's not exactly a spike, but it's a receptor, and and so we can modify receptors by experience. And so the action, for example, sex hormones can modify the effect of oxytocin. So the interaction between oxytocin and testosterone, for example, modifies its action. So oxytocin, that's amazing. Yeah, oxytocin has that capacity for protecting us not only from the adversity that we experience through the sympathetic system, the vasopressin system, but it also has a capacity for protecting us against infection. So over the last 30 to 40 years, we've discovered that oxytocin has an amazing eclectic ability. For example, it reduces inflammation. It has an immune capacity. It has an effect on the gut function. You know, the gut brain connection is often modified through the effect of oxytocin. And so, you know, that old sort of cliche that, you know, I had butterflies in my stomach. Well, it turns out that feeling that we experience when we're nervous is often a protective factor, because there is some inherent protective value about related to the expression of oxytocin. Usually it helps us move to a place of safety. And I just want to mention that as well. That bonding experience that a mom and baby experience develops a sense of trust. It one needs to feel in a safe place in order to flourish. And if you think about, yesterday we talked about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and feeling safe is a really important aspect of need. And we talked about, for example, right now, we all feel a little bit unsafe because of the threat posed by COVID. That's a fairly shared experience. Right. And I think that we talked a little bit about how that impacts on our mental health and our mental well-being. We feel threatened at the moment. And we're not necessarily flourishing as human beings. In fact, crossing the street and moving away from someone, or not shaking hands, all of those non-verbal pro-social gestures that we would be using on a pre-COVID basis, those have been taken away from us. And I think that's one of the realities of living in the pandemic, is that we've been asked to adopt behaviors which don't feel right somehow. There's a kind of, it goes against human nature to cross the street, to move away from someone, to not put your arm around somebody when they're feeling distressed. That kind of irks. It goes against who we are as human beings. And so
you mentioned early prenatal adversity.
Right.
I'd like you to amplify a little on what all counts as adversity in a prenatal period besides alcohol. But I've also read things about epigenetics, that prenatal experiences actually have a permanent and genetically transmissible effect. So that the children of a person who's been affected by some adversity in prenatal life, even their children will be scarred by this. It's a horrible thought, but has the work been done on the effects of adversity and oxytocin and so on in that sense too? Do you know?
Well, let me just back up a little bit in terms of the Human Genome Project. When that was completed, we thought that we were pretty close to moving forward in terms of understanding the way in which human behavior and human development would unfold. Turns out there's another layer on top of the genome, which determines the expression of the genome, and that's called the epigenome. So the way that I like to think of it is the dimmer switch on a light. The dimmer switch will allow the light to be fully on or fully off. So if you think about the dimmer switch as a gene, So the gene can be fully on, producing protein, or it can be fully off, not producing protein. So the epigenome allows that dimmer switch to slide up and down. So if you think about it, a gene can be fully expressed, fully producing protein, or it can be turned off. So the epigenetic phenomena, and love is an epigenetic phenomena, just like alcohol can be an so adversity, meaning alcohol, versus love, which is a positive aspect. So you can be fully expressed or fully turned off. So those they're called tags. These little tags are linked to the gene, and they can be transmitted from one generation to another. So the epigenome can be transmitted from one generation to another without changing the genome. So we've all heard of mutations, for example, and that's when the code of the gene changes. But what we're talking about here is transmission of the same DNA code from one generation to another, the same code, but it's the epigenome has changed the expression of the code.
I guess it wouldn't implant a particular attitude or form of
Right.
behavior in itself, but it would maybe modulate the extent to which that behavior tends to appear, or so.
Another way that I heard it expressed, this is not my original thought, it's like an orchestra. And each member of the orchestra is a gene, but nothing happens until the leader picks up his or her wand and starts the music. So that's the full expression of what we call the phenotype. In other words, the human being is the music. But the individual members of the orchestra generate the music, and it all comes together as a wonderful sound. The epigenome determines the reading of the music. So otherwise, music is just notes on a piece of paper.
When does this happen? Is it, I've heard that prenatal experience, adversity,
right,
the mother's stress or other things can change the baby in ways that not only affect its experience in adulthood, but then its offspring.
Yeah, so you asked, well, what types of adversity are we talking about? We're talking about poverty. We're talking about malnutrition. We're talking about living in a home where there's substance use. We're talking about domestic violence. We're talking about homelessness. We're talking about a range of adverse risk factors. Now, this is in the prenatal life, okay? And all of those factors can be relevant in the postnatal life as well. So
how is that transmitted, though? Moving the child from the moment of conception up to the age of 25, at what stage does this kick in? Is it into that child's genes in prenatal period? Already the genes are being affected. The genes that are going to be in the reproductive system in adulthood already are being affected prenatally.
Without changing the code. You remember the code is little repeats, and the code stays the same, but the expression of the code. Another way that I've used when I'm teaching this is a paragraph in a book. All the letters of the paragraph are there, okay, but they don't make sense because there are no spaces between the words, and you don't know which is a capital, which is an uppercase, which is a lowercase, where there's a comma, where there's a stop, or whether there's an indent. What the epigenome does, it makes it readable.
Oh,
so that's another.
I love that metaphor. Yeah.
So that's a third way of, so the code, the letters in the paragraph are the same. What the epigenome does is it makes it readable so that it makes sense.
So what's the mechanism for that epigene?
Yeah, well, there are jargon terms, methylation, histone modification, acetylation. These are biochemical terms to describe the way in which the epigenome is affected. The most widely known is methylation. It's a term. It's CH3, and it's a little tag that fits onto onto part of the genome to express the genome. And that methylation tag can be translated. Actually, First Nations people have known about this for a long time. They talk about looking 7 generations into the future. And what they're in effect talking about is the effect of epigenetics. So that things that happen today will be transferred to subsequent generations without changing the code. Mm-hmm. So it's the nature and the nurture. It used to be a dichotomy. It turns out it's not at all. It's a dance in some ways. There's another way I've heard it described. It's a dance. It's a kind of how it interacts with each other. It's nature and nurture.
But then say, let's jump from generation 1 to generation 4. And this poor guy is still suffering the effect of his great-great-grandmother's indiscretion. And then he meets a lovely lady, and they have such a good relationship that she cancels out these negative effects of his great-great-grandmother. Isn't that a lovely notion?
Isn't that but that's the exciting part of this story, that you can mitigate, you can remove some of those the effects of the adversity in subsequent generations, if you provide those positive experiences that I had talked about.
It just gives such a depth of meaning to one's life. Thinking that, we normally think, okay, we get born, we live to 80 years old, and we kick the bucket, and that's it. And nobody, within 2 generations, nobody will even remember our name or who we were or anything about us. So life is ephemeral. But what you're saying here is the relationships that we have now go on and on, affecting indefinitely. And my God, it gives me goosebumps to think about it. Isn't that? I mean, it's also horrible, but it's amazing to think about it.
Right. And if you think about, to go back to chemistry 101, that concept of homeostasis, getting back in balance. Yes. One of the effects of oxytocin is the restorative effect. It restores a system which is out of balance. So one of the living with stress, for example, is a very demanding, you mentioned cortisol at the very beginning. Mm-hmm. Chronic stress, we know, has an effect on a whole range of systems. And we can live with stress if it's a one-off. We go up, we get our cortisol response, we come down again. But chronic stress over a long period of time is what we call a cumulative response. It builds. And then, of course,
yesterday, Jonathan, I think it was yesterday, I read in the New York Times or someplace that there's a new discovery that sleeplessness is attributable to cortisol. That if you have insomnia, that's what's bothering you, is your cortisol level. Isn't that interesting? Now, I have a lot of sleeplessness now. It's mostly about pain from arthritis, but I get up during the night and read or something like that. I wouldn't say I feel stressed. I feel comfortable. Right. But this has to be, as I understand it, caused by some kind of cortisol effect that maybe I'd like to get rid of. I don't know.
Well, I come back to the concept of balance, of homeostasis. That experiment that you did in chemistry, where you just one drop, it turns the color from blue to pink. Remember that?
Titration.
Well, yes. Titration, exactly. Titration, and you know this. and I would suggest that not only is that relevant for us as individuals, but it's also relevant for us as a society too. That that when we are out of balance, when we're out of kilter, as it is, then it doesn't. I'm just talking about what's happening now. There's a kind of society that COVID is an existential threat. It threatens us not only as individuals, but it also has potential for impacting on global relations, for example, because there seem to be countries that are being excluded from vaccines, for example, vaccine nationalism. It's the threat has basically brought out into the open the cracks within our society. It's shining a light on or magnifying some of the inherent systemic flaws that we have. And I think that we need, in terms of the post-pandemic, this pandemic anyway, world, we hopefully will have learned from that experience and move forward in terms of addressing some of those systemic flaws.
Okay, now I want to say that I think that people differ in the way they respond to some of the same stimuli or lack of stimuli, the social isolation, for example, because most of the people I talk to say that they are feeling really deprived of human contact because they can't be physically present with somebody that the people they love, their families or whatever. And I've not done a survey to find out how true that is, but it's absolutely not universal, because I've been living in a complete isolation, or 99% isolation, for the last 13 months. And I'm just feeling great. I'm having the time of my life because I have these wonderful, friendly conversations with people like you. And I don't know whether you're giving me good oxytocin jolts or not, but certainly I feel this is a very rich social life to have 5 days a week, wonderful conversations with somebody interesting. And I don't miss the physical contact. But, Doug Roach wrote an article for Peace Magazine lamenting the coming of Zoom, because he says people will probably continue using it instead of going to meetings. And he likes to go to meetings because he can hug people there.
Right. But
yeah, we talked yesterday a little bit about the importance of physical contact for the production of oxytocin or whatever. Go into that a little bit, please.
Yeah. So, Doug, we were talked yesterday a little bit about the importance of oxytocin release and hugging. There are little receptors in the back of your neck, touch receptors, and on your shoulders, which is very difficult for you to touch, to release. It's very difficult to give yourself a neck massage, for example. Someone else has to do it for you. And it turns out that when that happens, oxytocin seems to be released by these little receptors. So in other words, you need someone else.
Could a machine do it?
I'm sorry?
Could a massage machine do it?
Not to the same extent. It seems to be based on human-to-human interaction. So I think that's what Doug is talking about there. And it's much more like, for example, you're smiling there. Yeah. And so I'm able to interpret your smile in a positive way. That's a very sophisticated, very complex interpretation. Okay. It's like when I know that you're genuinely interacting with me based on your facial response. And of course, that's a very deep biological interaction, the facial response. And language, of course, comes later, because we're able to interpret facial responses and nonverbal cues ahead of our ability to understand language. In evolutionary terms, I'm talking about. Language came later. Right? But our ability to interpret nonverbal cues came much earlier in our evolutionary development. Right. So to come back to the question of the oxytocin is really important for the development of trust You think about the infant mother bond. That's a trusting relationship. And without that, certainly the first 1,000 days of a child's life, postnatal life, is key to establishing the basis of trust, of feeling of safety, of security, of attachment, as it's called, bonding. And so once that is established, then that is an architecture, as it were, or a structure for then further development and flourishing as a human being. And if that's disrupted in some way, then that may lead to mental health difficulties later in life.
Actually, what I was thinking of is the importance of touch in the lives of adults, and the fact that we are socially deprived now because of COVID. Yeah. And you were saying yesterday that this is going to have a lasting effect now, that because of the deprivation and adversity. Yeah. Of social isolation. Now, the thing is that you say that physical contact, or yesterday you said that physical contact is extremely important. And, who would deny that? I certainly wouldn't. But my interest in the past, I about 18 years ago, I wrote a book called Two Aspirins and a Comedy about something that I got interested in when I was having my hips replaced, because I had a lot of pain. I was waiting for surgery. I had to wait a long time. And I started watching a television show that gave me wonderful emotion. Now, I wasn't under great stress emotionally at the time. I just didn't have a lot of emotion at all. One way, life was just sort of a routine thing. But I would find strong positive emotions when I would watch this television show. It's called Northern Exposure. And almost always I got very attached to and fond of and very involved with the lives of these people, which I watched every day because it was in reruns every day. And I found that without anybody touching me, that after watching one of those shows, I would not have pain for about 2 or 3 hours. And that discovery made me start looking at the effect of vicarious emotion. In other words, the emotion that I was feeling, those good emotions, were the friendly relationships of these fictional characters, right? Who were I would never touch in my whole life or any physical way, but I was getting replicating in my body through empathy all of the experiences that the people I was attached to were having. So right. They would have these lovely conversations or sessions together, and I would feel relief of pain, because I think it was oxytocin that I was generating in myself as an empathetic relationship with these imaginary people, fictional.
Right.
So that means that that it's possible to have very strong emotions and physiological effects of emotions, health effects, which I got into as looking at all the various hormones that are affected by relationships. And that's what part of the book was about. But so it's possible to have those without physical contact. And that's where I think the distinction between what you're saying and what interested me is very, very important. I don't know how to resolve how much of it is really you need physical contact, and how much of it is the empathy with the other person and the replication of their experiences in your own body.
So one of the features of oxytocin as a peptide is that it is extremely ubiquitous, and it has the capacity, as we've learned over the last 30 to 40 years, to be involved in important systems responsible for homeostasis. And so it's not just responsible for, it's not just involved in the touch system, but it's also involved in the social reciprocity. If you think about the backwards and forwards, the relationship that we're talking about here. And we're able to fall in love not only with our own children, but with other people. Adoption, for example, someone else's child, or a pet, or we are able to have that release of emotional experience, interaction. It turns out that if you measure salivary oxytocin levels in our dogs, turns out that every time that you interact with them, they have an oxytocin response as well.
Isn't
So
that lovely to know?
it's
You're making my day with all of
yeah.
these gems of discovery that I didn't know about.
Well, you know, because if you think about flourishing, it's not a one-way street. It's reciprocal. It's backwards and forwards. And it comes back to what I was saying earlier on about homeostasis. You know, we have to give and take. That's why we engage in chit chat. That's why we engage in it. Well, actually, in culture, we receive benefit. It's an interaction. It's reciprocity, and I think it's a very deep biological system based on deep time, and that's not to say that there's not a space here for spirituality. I think there is space for spirituality because we are meaning-seeking people. In other words, we look.
Why are you contrasting spirituality to deep time? I lost you make an antithesis there, but I didn't understand.
Yeah. Oh, well, we have flourished as a species, I think, through our connectivity with other people.
Mhm.
And one of the mechanisms in which we do that is through organizations, through cultural activities, through reciprocal involvement with other people, whether it's a men's group or whether it's a spiritual group. In other words, we are able to connect and seek meaning. And I think that that's one of the reason I bring that up is because a lot of when I talk about deep biology, I've had some little bit of a pushback here in sense of, well, where is the space for the divine here? In other words, where's divinity in this story? Where is God in this story? And I said, well, my response would be, well, there's space for spirituality and biology. In fact, it's one and the same. So that's why I'm making the connection here. Francis Collins, who was Bill Clinton, who was appointed, you've probably seen him on TV recently. He was in charge of the Human Genome Project. He wrote a book called The Language of God, and which was very interesting as a scientist, talking about the expression of the genome, actually. And so there is space for spiritual connectedness. Let me put it to you that way.
I just had a conversation with Joy Kogawa a couple of days ago in which we discussed this. And one of the points that came up was the notion of survival of the fittest or natural selection. That has been often cited by evolutionists as proof of the unnecessariness of God. In other words, you've got an explanation for how species come into existence. Therefore, you don't need to talk about God. That's an irrelevant thing. But to me, the notion that, who invented such a great system, as something that would, by natural selection, introduce species and so on. That kind of, the fact is, there's obvious intelligence in that process. Well, there also has to be intelligence in the invention of DNA, and the language of transmitting, and there's intelligence in the way the planets stay in orbit. There's intelligence throughout the whole system. So,
right.
I couldn't even imagine thinking of a universe without something running it or some principle behind it.
Yeah. Well,
so biology is not something other than or proof of the lack of God, but rather evidence for something.
Yeah, and so if you think about, again, to come back to the code, the DNA, the genome, and the epigenome, if we might like to think of spirituality as being an aspect of epigenetics. In other words, allowing the expression of the genome through a change in the environment. In fact, nurturing. It may be, you could argue that the spirituality part of our lives, and we all, I mean, to a certain extent, we all experience spirituality when we look out at the ocean or when we look out at a mountain range. You know, we have that sense of awe. Mm-hmm. We have that sort of and I'm not going to go into the biological implications of awe, but what I'm saying is that we can have expression of the genome through the epigenome, and love and spirituality may be aspects of the epigenome. And so we can change the expression of the genome through a range of concrete or direct and indirect influences. And I would suggest that connecting with other people through a faith group may be an expression of that. Somehow we get a sense of belonging, a sense of meaning, a sense of purpose through connections with other people. And it comes back to deep biology, that when we came out of the ocean onto the land and we survived through the use of, through the expression of vasopressin, but then we had to find a safe place to flourish. And that was a system that there are a range of systems that have allowed us to do that. And I would suggest that oxytocin is part of that story.
You know, if I could go a little bit afield, far from this, one of the things that it's almost as if I had to make a decision in my life whether I was going to work on structural societal level dynamics, things like the economy, the laws, how to build institutions, how to, you know, run the courts, things of that kind, or my inner well-being, my spirituality, or my awareness of my own mental processes. There have been times when I did a lot of meditating and looking, you know, group dynamics, looking at relationships and so on. So the difference between the personal and the societal has always been, it's like a toggle switch. I can do one or the other, but I can't mix them. Now, what I'm hearing from you today is kind of the bridge between the two. Because if you're right, I think the implication is that the way we feel and the way we relate to other people, which is part of the why we feel the way we do, that those relationships have a kind of permanence in our genetic system, epigene, and that therefore, if you're not very political, you can make a huge contribution to life by just being nice, you know, nice to other people. Now, I don't really think that being nice to other people automatically translates into being peaceful or creating a world without war. I think how we run our military, or how we run our government, or how we run our politics, that those systems have a life of their own. And they take people who may be very sweet people personally, and they make them into killers because they just say, here's your order, you go kill. And people mostly do. And so I think that it's a poor place to start trying to make peace in the world by cultivating inner peace. But that's not to say that cultivating inner peace is totally a self-centered self-indulgence, because what you're showing is that it does have effects in our relations with other people, which give them oxytocin, if nothing else, and change the lives of their great-grandchildren.
And, you know, Dr. Bonnie Henry, who's our provincial health officer here, she closes each of her daily statements with a meme which has become the sort of ubiquitous here in BC, and it's be kind, be calm, be safe. And she didn't say be nice, be calm, be safe. She said be kind, And there's a piece in the opinion section of the Globe and Mail this last weekend about the difference of the word nice, and you use the word nice, that's why I'm picking up on it. And Canadians have been built an international reputation on being nice, whereas in Australia, and this was the basis of the piece, the contrasting the COVID between Australia and Canada. And the nice approach is not always the best approach, but the kind approach, which has integrity built into it, which is an empathy and an understanding of the other, which is the kind. This is why Bonnie Henry says, "Be kind." It's not only being kind to yourself, but it's being kind to others. It's the inclusion of others in that concept. So anyway, nice is okay, but sometimes you end up compromising yourself in terms of your values, whereas being kind has an authenticity and an integrity about that concept. And it's based on biology, because in order for us, it's me and we, right? It's not only me, but it's we. In other words, I'm, a bunya, as they say in East Africa. It's that I can thrive when we thrive. In other words, we grow together, so that we're not independent of each other's flourishing. Yeah.
I think your notion of kindness may be pointing towards something that is, I think it's a dilemma for many people. There used to be a concept of laissez-faire teaching versus authoritarian teaching versus, I don't know, there's a system of typology of some kind. But I think and you deal with children a lot, and I expect this comes up in your interactions with parents, is that kindness does not mean leniency necessarily, but has to include kind of accountability, learning to. Now, the example that sticks out in my mind most recently is a piece I wrote about the comparison between the way Barack Obama's mother brought him up and the way Trump was brought up, where Obama's mother would insist that he empathize. She would say, how do you think you'd feel if somebody did that to you after he'd done some infraction? And she would demand that he consider that,
Right.
and empathize with that other person. Whereas it was almost apparently, according to Mary Trump, the woman who's a cousin, I guess, of Trump, that in that family, empathy would be regarded as weakness and cowardice and shame, and ever care about another person or listen to how they're feeling. So I think that the lesson about empathy is that kids have to be taught that, and that also means kindness, but an insistence on recognizing the needs of other people and accountability for one's actions. And the parents who don't do that, and God knows there are a lot of us, are falling short in upbringing, parenting technology. Am I going too far astray in linking this empathy with accountability?
No, I think again, I'll bring it back to biology again. I think that the word empathy and the word kindness speak to that social interactions, in reciprocity, the relationship between human beings, and that we again go back to that bonding that occurs when a mom falls in love with her baby. That sets the stage, sets the template, sets the architecture for future brain development, and not only development in terms of how we learn, how we behave, our mental health, but also, it turns out, our physical health as well. A part of the brain responsible for monitoring blood pressure and stress that can be altered by changes within those early sort of 1,000 days, I thought, the first 3 years of life. And if you think about what happens when the mom is looking at the baby and feeding the baby cries and then is fed. So that establishes a pattern or a behavior in which reduces cortisol. In other words, if a baby is hungry and is fed, then it establishes a nice network that the baby can relax. And so you feel comfortable. You would go to a place of safety that is okay. I can cry. I know I'm going to be fed. It's going to be okay. But if a baby is not fed immediately and is left and is not picked up and is not held and is not comforted and loved in that predictable way, then it can disrupt. It has the potential for disrupting some of those early networking systems. So I would suggest that later on, when adversity comes along, you're in a baby who has had that experience of being loved and nurtured and responded to in the early days and weeks of life, then is able to deal with adversity in a more competent way.
I want to bring in, toward the end of our conversation, I don't like to bring up unpleasant things because then I have to figure out a way to turn it around and leave on an upbeat. But I have to introduce a thought that occurs to me, which is rather unpleasant. A few years ago, there was a book by somebody, and I don't remember the book or the name of the person, but the argument was that crime rates among young people, usually, of course, young males, that it had gone down. And people were trying to figure out what's the explanation. The explanation was traced back, according to these people, to the notion that abortion became possible, legal, and more frequently used. I don't know what's more frequently used, but anyway, that was the link they were making. And the logic was mothers, women who become pregnant unwillingly and wish that and know that they cannot give proper attention to their babies should have an abortion if they want it, because those kids don't get the kind of nurturance that you're referring to. And indeed, they do go up to be more antisocial than children who got the nurturance that they needed. So when a woman says that she knows she can't offer that, and that she wishes she were not pregnant, it's a good thing to let her have an abortion. I don't like to talk about abortion. I'm not sure I would ever be able to do it myself. But it's a very interesting argument in the context that you just said. Would that make sense to you?
I don't know enough about the topic to be able to comment on that matter. But what I will say is that nature has an amazing capacity for addressing adversity in terms of its reproduction. So, for example, first trimester abortions or miscarriages, as they're called, often when you examine the material, the embryonic material, you will often find significant disruptions in the chromosomal material. So nature has an ability to recognize that material as being non-viable, as it were, or not able to survive. So it has a mechanism of dealing with that. And I think that
obviously, sorry, but it certainly isn't 100% because we do have birth defects, genetically transmitted disorders.
Yeah, and also, I mean, for example, technology now has allowed us to provide support for individuals who have genetic disorders. I'm thinking now of Down syndrome, trisomy 21, for example. So we know that people with trisomy 21 Down syndrome are able to be integrated in society, and we now accept that type of intellectual disability in other words, we're changing the way in which we think about diversity and disability as we speak. So that doesn't really speak to your question about abortion, and I really don't have any sort of thoughts around that.
Okay, let's tie this back to our peace work.
Yeah,
You know,
yeah, that word peace. I see it as, in many ways, I see trust as being part of that construct of peace. And I would suggest that not only do we need homeostasis at an individual personal level to maintain our balance, sense of balance, but also you roll that out at a family level, at a cultural level. And right now, I would suggest that we are out of balance. And a lot of those changes, we talk about natural selection. Turns out that since 1945, we have been engaged in unnatural selection. In other words, we've developed the capacity as human beings to destroy ourselves. And let me count the ways in which we are able to do that. And the list grows longer. From nuclear annihilation to climate change to COVID to Rachel Carson, and more recently, an update on the declining fertility rates, for example. Turns out that fertility, particularly sperm count at a global level, has dropped to around about 49% over the last 30 or 40 years. And the prediction is that if things continue, then we will have a fairly infertile male population.
Is that attributed entirely or just a little bit to the these plastic things that are contaminated?
Yes, yeah, that's right. Yeah. I mean, it's not only the DDT, which is what Carson talked about, but right the way through to something called PFAS, which is a chemical found in flame retardants, and particularly around, there's been some interesting work around military installations, Air Force bases, for example. They have practice drills where they bring out the flame retardants and so on. So phthalates, you name it, BPA, all of those chemicals that we've introduced into our environment since 1945 seem to be having a comeback to what I was saying, cumulative risk.
I think what we have to end this conversation on is an explicit recognition that many of us are doing very different kinds of work. And we think that we are in silos, just doing unique, solving problems that have no connection to the rest of the world. But this is one big system, and everybody who's contributing to it is contributing to the whole system. And this conversation, if anyone has ever made that clear, it's very much in my mind at the moment that all of the work that we do to try to improve the world, even in our local neighborhood or in our families, that's a contribution too. So,
yeah. Okay. So just one closing comment on the issue of global governance. The issues that we've described here certainly take a significant meaning when we talk about the failure of local. These are not local issues; these are global issues. And one of the problems that we have, I think, in terms of bringing things back into balance, is we don't have a global governance system which is able to address these huge issues. Municipal governments, of course, can deal with local issues, but we need a global governance system that will allow us to address some of these big issues. And look at COVID, the situation here in Canada, for example, where we have each province and each territory rolling out its own program. And yet, COVID doesn't stop at the Alberta BC border. It crosses boundaries, just like ionizing radiation, just like chemicals. They cross boundaries. So we need a much more global perspective to bring things back into balance.
I agree 1000%. This has been such a stimulating and useful conversation, Jonathan. I really want to thank you for it.